Hello everybody, Earth.Otherwise here, and welcome to Reiterated, where I take a look at a piece of media which seeks to teach us something about game design and iterate on the ideas presented. Today we will be looking at the Game Design Conference talk, Building Game Mechanics to Elevate Narrative in Oxenfree, with speaker Sean Krankel. Sean always wanted to make a story game, and that is what his studio focused on. This talk will be focused on story and dialogue trees in particular. All the mechanics in the game are story-focused. They are about letting the player push and pull the narrative. As an indie developer, you have to stand out, and the Oxenfree team did this by mixing story and mechanics at every level of design. Most games, great games even, have a rhythm of a mechanics-driven encounter followed by a story beat, doing this 1-2 throughout the game, obviously not mixing the two forms of entertainment very well, sometimes even cutting it into gameplay and cutscene segments. The developers of Oxenfree set out to make a game where every mechanic served only to further the story. However, they didn't want to make a simple visual novel. If you try to break into the visual novel space, you'll need to create a truly stunning and awe-inspiring visual novel, which means you'll need either a very talented or very experienced writing and art team. As indie developers, we usually don't have access to such high-quality team members. You might think you're making the next Fate visual novel, but you'll probably end up with something more like The Bottom of the Well, an indie title that I reviewed. Go look at that. It's an okay game, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to bring in the big bucks, or break you into a scene so that you can continue making games on the regular. The developers started from the basic idea that they felt hadn't been done in games very well or very often. It would feel like a coming-of-age story with supernatural elements. They knew what the basic story would be near the beginning of development. Usually, teams start with mechanics. Instead, this team started with the basic story. Having this different starting point and central goal would help them stand out from the crowd. When the developers were looking at what the player is doing and why they are doing it in games, they felt that there should be a meaningful connection between the two parts. In another game, like 7 Days to Die, an example would be that the reason you are shooting zombies should be just as meaningful as why you are shooting them. That they are a threat just isn't good enough of a reason. They have to be threatening something that you, the player, want to protect. What you are doing is the plot of a game, the mechanics and encounters, the shooting in the previous example, and why you are doing it is the story, the reason you're doing things, if you will. Many games treat their mechanics, as toys, things that are fundamentally fun to play with, but a toy that stays the same gets boring after a while. Most games amp up the challenges to keep you interested in their mechanics. Instead of adding challenge, the devs of Oxenfree decided to make a story-focused game where the stakes of the story grew as the game went on, not the challenge. Your decisions didn't become more difficult, but the consequences of them grew more important. This made communication the central focus for the game. Communication and the implications that it had on the story was decided to be the main driving force of development. It's important to have a focused game. You don't want to be refining mechanics that you're not going to end up putting in the game. You will, of course, create mechanics in the prototype phase just to try them out, but the mechanics you keep should all be working to elevate your main goal. In this instance, the goal is elevating the narrative. The story is split into two parts. The first act, which is very slow, to get the player used to the playstyle and to get them invested in the characters. People criticize the game for this very slow first act, but without it, you might run into the problem of, why should I care about these characters, later in the game when things start to happen. This and all other creative decisions were made to smooth out the story interactivity. Control is never taken away from the player, and control is direct. This isn't a point and click. Oxenfree was designed with a controller in mind, a device that many people say you can more easily use to immerse yourself in the game. Due to the game being narrative-focused and communication-focused, the design team wanted communication to be more of an ability, something that you use meaningfully, not a menu choice, not good guy choices and bad guy choices, and not shades of gray choices. To decide what dialogue would be available to the player, the writer had to play out every scenario to the end and work backwards through the choices you would want to make to get there. The writer was always asking himself and his team, what do you want to say here? He wanted for there to never be a time when you wanted to say something and you didn't have a prompt to do so. In many games, dialogue is simply a way to move the story forward. You don't really have a choice. There's a good choice that moves the story forward, the bad guy choice that moves the story forward, or the neutral choice that moves the story forward. Rather than all choices moving the story forward, instead the team wanted to give the player options that they would actually want to use. Alex, the main character, will talk if and when you make her talk. Silence is an option, and characters will continue their conversations without you. Interrupting people is an option, to get a word in edgewise. NPCs can and will pick up conversations if you cut them off or respond with stony silence. Hundreds of lines of dialogue had to be written to allow the player this kind of freedom of expression. There was no way to do this with a simple system. Instead, the designer had to hand-tweak every design option, setting which options could interrupt and which couldn't, how long the boxes stayed up, and how the NPCs would respond. To this end, making communication and story the main focus, the team eventually killed off every mechanic that wasn't communication-based. Instead of, say, a weapon, you have a radio for puzzle solving and communication with the MacGuffin. The visual design, how far away the camera is, and even how fast the character moves, is made to facilitate conversation. The developers always wanted you looking to the main character and what she can and is saying. To this end, the speech bubbles, your communication ability, are right next to the main character's head, keeping you focused on the center rather than some text boxes at the bottom of the screen. Eventually, though, the mechanics started to inform the story. Once they had a bunch of mechanics informed by their story and had refined them, they could then let the mechanics start to tell them how the story might need to be changed to let the player get used to the mechanics and to use them to their best ability. This informed the slow first act that I mentioned earlier. This also meant that the culmination of the story needed to fit the mechanics that were already in place. The team played around with introducing new mechanics for the end of the game to make it more of a skill challenge, but in the end, that didn't steer them towards the main focus of the game. This meant that even the final chapters had to conform to the communication mechanics that are the main focus of gameplay. In the end, there are a few simple ideas conveyed here, with specific implementation that worked for this game. It's becoming clearer and clearer as I do these videos that a strong central idea for your game is important. It can't just be Call of Duty but with ducks. It needs to be something around which you can base the entire game. A strong emotion, like being tense, or a story that you want to tell, or a gameplay mechanic that's fun to play with. Here we also learned that you can't systemize everything, especially not when you have a specific story that you want to tell. Sometimes you just need to buckle down and be ready to hand make each and every interaction between your characters so that things flow smoothly. Most developers will do this using cutscenes, but the team that worked on Oxenfree didn't want to take control away from the player, making the story more directly about the player and not just the characters. I also learned that it's perfectly fine to have a bunch of tools and prototyping scenarios well into development that won't end up in the final game. You need to know for sure how you want to polish your game before you start doing so, and that can mean building tools and prototyping exactly how you want to lay things out long into development. Just make sure that you have an eye on the clock, or you might be pushing out an unfinished game. This has been Earth.Otherwise. Thank you for joining me.